Well, welcome everyone. It's fabulous to have you joining us for Travel Tuesday for ASA. And I know we're in for a treat tonight. We have award-winning artist and art historian and, of course, wonderful tour leader, David Henderson, talking to us about Caravaggio in Sicily. I'm actually leaving tomorrow to lead a tour in Sicily along with David, but he has another tour in Sicily coming up later this year. He's also got a fabulous sounding tour in Venice coming up. And of course, he also has tours in the south of France. So do have a look at the ASA website. Check out David's wonderful tours. They are always a treat to go on. And do think about joining him on one of his really fantastic art tours. So tonight, David is talking about a subject that I think is very close to his heart. I always love hearing David talk about art. I just feel I learn so much. It's always a treat. So would you please welcome David Henderson to talk about Caravaggio in Sicily. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Susanna. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon in Sicily, where we'll be seeing some of these paintings firsthand. Thank you for joining me, everyone. My great pleasure to say a few words about a person who I think is one of the most sort of fascinating characters of all of art history, Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. And so Caravaggio's usually known by the town with which he's associated, the town where he spent much of his early life. So I want the focus of my talk, or the sort of latter part of my talk, to concentrate on the paintings that Caravaggio made in Sicily, but I think it's really important to get a sense of Caravaggio's biographical details, the story of his extraordinary life, because I think that will give us some really important insights into what he's doing and why, and what it is that what it is that makes his art so special, I suppose. And Caravaggio, he's a bit like Picasso in that his art is very biographical, and we know this with Caravaggio because we often see a self-portrait inserted into some of his paintings. So we know that he's sort of deeply involved in the subject that he's painting. So this isn't a self-portrait. This is a portrait by one of his contemporaries, but I think conveys very well something of his alertness, indeed his sort of intensity of character. So just to give you a few kind of, as I say, biographical details, he's born in 1571, we think in Milan. He grows up in what appears to be fairly sort of comfortable surroundings. His father is a kind of household manager for one of the noble families of Milan, the Sforza. They were the leading family of Milan in the earlier 16th century. And the Sforza lord is married to this lady here, Costanza Colonna, who's the daughter of a very famous and powerful Roman family. Her father had been one of the heroes of the Battle of Lepanto, which had taken place around about the time of Caravaggio's birth. And she appears sort of in the background of Caravaggio's life at certain important junctures. So she's almost like a sort of a guardian angel to Caravaggio throughout his life. She doesn't appear explicitly, but we feel that she's kind of acting behind the scenes. And this is there's a family tradition of this. One of her aunts, I think it was her great aunt, Vittoria Colonna, was the companion of another Michelangelo, Michelangelo Buonarroti. So there's a sort of a family tradition of that. So the young Caravaggio's life was, it would appear quite a comfortable one, growing up in this noble household. But all of that came to an end when he was a young boy, when a terrible plague struck Milan and took away not only a number of his male relatives, but his father. And the pop psychologists amongst us can speculate on how Caravaggio's character might have developed differently had he had a sort of a strong male authority figure in his life. So sort of catastrophic event, and we can I suppose imagine memories of this in some of his later paintings emerging. One of the heroes of this terrible plague was a man named Carlo Borromeo, who's a very important figure in the Counter-Reformation period. This is the period that we're in, this sort of fight back of the Catholic Church against the Protestant Reformation, all the sort of the huge revolution in Christianity created by Martin Luther. And big on the agenda of the Counter-Reformation is reaffirming the importance of good works. And Carlo Borromeo, without any thought for his safety or his health, looked after many plague victims, and this was one of the sort of the many acts which later led to him becoming a saint, a very important saint in the Counter-Reformation period. And he had a very Carlo Borromeo had a rather sort of austere and a rather severe vision of Christianity, of salvation. And I should mention this because I think it is important in understanding Caravaggio's iconography, Caravaggio's worldview, his understanding of human life, salvation, sin, all of these things which play such a central role in his paintings. And for Carlo Borromeo, the poor had a special status in the eyes of God, and so I suppose because they were not so connected with wealth, with worldly things, with power, he considered them to have a sort of an innate sanctity, as it were. And this sort of valuing, this favouring of ordinary people, again, is something that we see again in Caravaggio's art. So I think it's important to mention some of these sort of background factors in his life. Milan was a great industrial centre. It was a great sort of centre for the production of, it was very famous for its armour and for producing fine steel weapons. And every young Milanese man ensured that he was able to handle the rapier, for instance, with great skill. And so again, the handling of weapons and this sort of undercurrent of, for want of a better word, violence is something that's in the background of Caravaggio's early life and upbringing. And Caravaggio certainly was highly skilled in the use of this deadly weapon, the rapier, which had emerged around about this time as a weapon of choice for those who want to combine it with the new firearms. So here's a view of Milan around about the time of Caravaggio. This is I can't remember who this painting is by now, but I've just put it in. It's a really lovely painting, actually. A good example of the tradition of northern realism. So the kind of painting that's being made in Lombardy and in northern Europe is very much in this kind of realist tradition. So it's a painting based on direct observation of the subject, a painting based on of really understanding light, of understanding the textures of things, and a desire to sort of transcribe the look of things as they really are. And you might think, well, what other way is there of painting? Well, there's another tradition that's very well established in central Italy and coming out of the High Renaissance, Michelangelo and all these people. So I think it's important to understand this background of realism from which Caravaggio emerges and in which he's trained. So he's trained, he's apprenticed, Caravaggio's apprenticed to a local painter, a man named Simone Petrizzano. He's with him for about 4 years, where he would have learnt the basics of his craft. We don't really have any paintings by him from this period, but clearly he was trained in the basics of the artist's craft. So in about 1591, 92, when Caravaggio's a young man, his mother has died, he suddenly leaves Milan. So he's really at the beginning of his career. There appear to be rumours that he's involved in some kind of crime, perhaps a murder. We don't know. So already at this young age, there's a sort of there's a cloud of violence, crime, and a very mercurial and aggressive nature. So this is part of the fascination of Caravaggio. He's an artist of genius, of enormous sensitivity and insight. But at the same time, he has this incredibly sort of violent, unpredictable temperament. So here, just a reminder of Italy being in the time of Caravaggio, around about the last decades of the 16th century. Of course, it's not a unified nation. It's a patchwork of city-states and principalities and independent states, mostly under the control of the Spanish. At this particular moment in history, Venice is independent. We can see Venice up there, the top right-hand corner. Milan just to the the left of it, to the west there, the Papal States in the middle, and if you go down to southern Italy and Sicily, there are a united kingdom. So each of these states has got its own jurisdiction, its own culture, and its own laws, which I think is a very important thing to keep in mind. So Caravaggio turns up in Rome, as say around about the early 1590s, and here's a picture of Rome a little bit after his time, maybe from around about 1700, but probably not much different from when he knew it. We wouldn't have had those two domes there on the left in the time of Caravaggio. That's at that's the Piazza, what's now the Piazza del Popolo, the northernmost gate of Rome. This is where all the pilgrims come into Rome, and the view is dominated on the right by the Villa Medici. So we're looking from a point where the Spanish Steps now stand. The Spanish Steps haven't been built yet at this time in history, but you can see there in the centre of the picture the area which again would have looked pretty much like that in Caravaggio's day, which was the artists' quarter of the city. So Caravaggio turns up and really starts his career at the very bottom rung of the ladder. He sort of lives a hand-to-mouth existence. He finds, for instance, employment in a household where his supervisor is a priest, and he lives a life that isn't particularly comfortable or luxurious, despite the noble surroundings. And Caravaggio later recalls that this priest gave him nothing but vegetables for breakfast, lunch, and the evening meal, and he sort of ironically nicknamed him Monsignor Insalata as a reminder of the rather austere life that he led as a young man finding his way in Rome. He gets a lucky break with the artist who painted this picture, a man known to history as the Cavaliere d'Arpino, who was a very fashionable artist in the day. He was one of the Pope's favourite painters. And you have to imagine Rome in this time is undergoing a real sort of transformation in its urban structure. There are a lot of people coming into the city, pilgrims, soldiers who are unemployed after the religious wars. It's a real Wild West sort of a place. Artists everywhere all vying for these commissions that they hoping to get from the church and from the religious orders. It's a town full of hustlers and people on the make, and all of the kind of the unrest and indeed the violence that might be associated with that. So it must have been an extraordinary place, late 16th century Rome. Anyway, here's the Cavaliere d'Arpino's rather sweet Annunciation, and which brings me to the kind of the prevailing artistic style at the end of the 16th century in Rome, which we know as mannerism. So it's a sort of a, shall we say, a decadent version, you could say, of the High Renaissance style. And the High Renaissance style and mannerism being, as its name suggests, a sort of a mannered style that's full of all sort of conventions and stereotypes. It does have a tendency to be rather insipid and rather sort of vapid in its execution and in its expression. But it's all based on drawing, on this High Renaissance idea of disegno, the idea that the drawing is the basis of painting, and in drawing, in observing nature, observing the human figure, you're not only drawing and recording what you see as the realists might do, but you're actually improving on nature. You're using your imagination, you're using your sense of the ideal to transform your subject into something greater and something beautiful. And from the very beginning, Caravaggio rejects this. He's a northern realist. He doesn't want all this kind of, I suppose what he would see is a rather sort of false transformation of the subject. Drawing's not important to him. So he cuts to the chase. He paints directly on his canvas. And this is I think, part of the revolution of Caravaggio. He's so direct in the way that he paints, and he's interested above all in nature, in using nature, things as they really look, things as they really appear to the eye, as the sort of the basis of let's say the emotional core of his paintings. So he paints directly on the canvas, and as I suggested earlier, he's looking at sort of real people he can see in the streets as his models, as the basis of his subjects. And so here's the young Caravaggio sort of flexing his artistic muscles and painting famous picture in the National Gallery in London, Boy Bitten by a Lizard. So early work in which the artist is using perhaps himself as a model. Again, it's the idea of the self-portrait and the autobiographical nature of his art. And he's here showing us that he's interested in realism, not only optical realism, and look at the beautiful way he's painted the light coming through that vase with the flower, but psychological realism, the expression on the face. And he's playing with very interesting themes here. So the boy reaches out for something attractive, desirable, the fruit, the flowers, something catches his eye. It's a metaphor for pleasure, for temptation. But what happens? He's bitten by a lizard. So the idea of worldly pleasures and their attendant perils are an early theme in his art, and one which he'll develop throughout his life. Caravaggio gets his big break with these two pictures. And again, this idea of the perils, of the sort of the pitfalls of worldly temptations. The card sharps on the left and the gypsy fortune teller on the right. So the very fresh-faced, almost baby-faced young man here, naive to the ways of the world, so interested in the card that he's going to play and so absorbed in all the money he's going to make at this card game that he doesn't realize that his partner is receiving a message from his accomplice looking over the young man's shoulder. And he's about to play the appropriate card, win the hand, and take all his money. So it's a very clever little piece of theatre, like a scene from a picaresque novel, perhaps, in which Caravaggio's exploring this idea of temptation and a kind of let's say a punishment for it almost. It's also he's also showing us again his virtuosity as a painter. Look at hopefully you can see even in this reproduction on your screen the extraordinary way he's painted, for instance, that feather in the young man's cap. It's a brilliant bit of painting. And the same things, similar things happening here. So here the theme is sort of love, desire. A young gypsy woman stops again, the same young man, modelled by Caravaggio's friend Mario Minniti, who we'll be hearing about in a little while. And again, he's so absorbed in her alluring gaze and the wonderful story she's telling him about how he will be soon finding love, that he doesn't realise that she's relieving him of his valuable ring. And so these two paintings caught the eye of a very influential connoisseur of art in Rome, a man named Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, who's quite an extraordinary figure. I mean, he's a fascinating man in his own right. And he's a patron of music, he's a patron of the sciences, he's a genuine intellectual. He's the kind of envoy of the Medici, the powerful Medici family in Rome. And like all cardinals, he lives in great style, and he invites Caravaggio he buys the paintings, which subsequently become quite famous. There are many copies of them that exist. And so it's Caravaggio's great break, and he goes to live in Cardinal del Monte's rather nice house, which here, not exactly as it looked in the 16th century. It was given a bit of a makeover, but you get a sense of the scale of it, the same size. It now serves as the Senate, the Italian Senate. It's not far from Piazza Navona in Rome. So Caravaggio not only benefits from, I suppose, the stimulation of all these important cultural figures who frequent his residence, but also the many contacts that he's able to make through Del Monte's network of friends and associates in the nobility of Rome who begin to commission works from Caravaggio. So his rise to fame is very steep from here. I'm sure you all know this wonderful painting. Again, the idea of Caravaggio invests his work with a sort of a little moral story. It's not just a still life. It's a symbol of, on the one hand, sin as represented by the apple with the wormhole, and salvation as represented by the Eucharistic grapes. And the whole work is infused with this sense of the temporal nature of things, of decay and flux. The still life is thought to be the first independent still life in art history. So it's a very important work in the history of art. I think it's fascinating. And we've been seeing lots of wonderful pictures of the moon recently, so I thought I'd put these in. Galileo Galilei was another of Cardinal del Monte's protege, and I think it's a fascinating parallel between these beautiful wash drawings that Galileo made of the moon seen through his telescope, and Caravaggio's imperfect apple, so embodying this idea of flux and decay and change. And Galileo's wash drawings of the moon upset the public of the day when they saw them, because everybody thought the moon was this smooth, perfect sphere. And it was part of the whole sort of worldview of the relationship between the Earth and the cosmos. And to see Galileo show the moon as something irregular and imperfect, just like earthly things, was a great shock at the time. So I think I'm not saying there's a direct causal link, but there's a fascinating parallel between the two. Caravaggio really left to fame with his paintings for the Contarelli Chapel and also his paintings in the Chirazi Chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo. And I'm sure you all know these works, which you can still see today in the place for which they were painted. The martyrdom here of St. Matthew, and the calling of Matthew, which is, I think, one of the all-time great paintings of any period. And here we see Caravaggio's use of his famous chiaroscuro for the first time fully developed. The way that Caravaggio uses this dramatic lighting, the deep shadows, sometimes called the tenebrism, the tenebrismo, which not only give a real sense of the weight of the moment, almost as though revealed by a flash of lightning, but to help to tell the story, so that the fall of light, the direction of light from right to left, leads us from the figure of Christ emerging from the shadows on the right-hand side to the figure of Matthew, who sort of gestures to himself with this sort of unforgettable motion of sort of who me. And Christ says, rise up and follow me. And Caravaggio, true to the text, shows Matthew's powerful legs flexing under the table. He's about to get up. So it's a fantastic integration of, again, real life, these real people that Caravaggio knows from the streets, these rather flashy, rather disreputable looking characters with their fine clothes, and they're counting their money, and the figures who are on the right-hand side of Christ and Peter, who of course represents the church, in their own world of shadows. So they're kind of in the world of the seedy tavern, but they're also removed from it. So he does that, I think, very cleverly. So it's all about looking. It's all about those who see, those who don't see, only seeing the sort of the money, the things of this world. Wonderful expression on Matthew's face there. And the hand of Christ here has been borrowed by Caravaggio from the Sistine Chapel. Although it's interesting that he reverses Adam's hand rather than using the hand of God. So perhaps there's some reference there to Christ redeeming the sin of Adam. I'm not sure. So what do they say? Good artists borrow, great artists steal. It's a good example of that, I think. So Caravaggio found favour with the sophisticated, the wealthy connoisseurs of Rome. Everyone wanted a painting by Caravaggio. He was in great demand. He was becoming famous, but he was also encountering resistance to what he was doing. And this is a famous example of that, the so-called Death of the Virgin that he painted for a religious community, one of the religious orders, in the poor district of Rome known as Trastevere. And Caravaggio has really departed from, I suppose, established convention here. And we have to remember that the Counter-Reformation period, the later 16th century, was a period in which the religious authorities were laying down very strict rules about how religious subjects should and should not be painted. So there were very strict rules about the decorum of a picture, the respectful way of showing the various personages in sacred dramas. And Caravaggio here has painted this very moving picture, which again is a combination of this optical realism, the light which falls over things, which brings the scene so vividly to life, this chiaroscuro, which creates a very sort of intense mood and really conveys, I think, the weight of the moment, but also a psychological realism, and the way you get this sense of a kind of a gathering intensity of reaction and reactions which, Caravaggio is inviting us to participate in as viewers, and the way this sort of gathers intensity until as we reach the figure, the lifeless figure of the Virgin. And of course, you may know that the real problem that this painting caused was that he made her look too much like simply a lifeless woman. And there was a great rivalries existed in late 16th century Rome, factions of artists who were all trying to sort of compete with each other or undermine each other's reputations. And Caravaggio's rivals put out the story that the model that he'd used for the Virgin Mary was perhaps a dead prostitute. Perhaps she'd even been fished out of the Tiber one night. All these rather lurid stories, which those who were disposed not to like the fiction, to be put off by its rather brutal realism, could well believe. But I think Caravaggio's. I mean, one of the interesting things about Caravaggio that he does have this very sort of forceful, kind of in your face way of painting things. I mean, the way he lights her head, her features, to really sort of bring their lifelessness to the fore. The way he makes her bare feet protrude almost as though she's got rigor mortis from the drapery. And this was one of the things that upset people. It was that it's said to be the bare feet. It wasn't a respectful way of showing this person. But I think Caravaggio is also a very subtle and understated painter. The delicate way I think that he represents the halo and the way the Virgin's hand lies upon her belly is a very discreet reminder of her role in the Christian story of the Mother of Christ. And rather than showing her being carried up to heaven with angels, he uses this bit of drapery that's got a very mysterious presence. It suggests a slow upward movement. So I think it's a fascinating painting. And the other fascinating thing about this painting is that even as it was rejected by, let's say, the sort of the middle management of this religious order, it was eagerly snapped up by a series of connoisseurs. It was bought by the Duke of Mantua immediately on the recommendation of his court painter, Peter Paul Rubens. And when the Gonzaga collection was sold, it was purchased by Charles I of England. And then when his collection was dispersed, it was bought by Cardinal Richelieu, and it's now in the Louvre. So it's hard to imagine a more prestigious provenance for any painting, let alone this one. But Caravaggio was, I think, he got very upset by these rejections. Here's the painting that replaced it. So just to give you an idea of the sort of conventional imagery that the patrons preferred. And Caravaggio, of course, is known for his outrageous behaviour, and we know quite a bit about him because of police records and court records of the time, and we get these wonderfully vivid little kind of vignettes of Caravaggio's life and behaviour in Rome. There's a very famous Roman dish you can still buy today, if you go to the Jewish quarter, of artichokes. And Caravaggio goes into a restaurant and orders a dish of artichokes. Some are cooked in butter, others are cooked in oil. And we know all of this from a description from a police or court record. And he's unsure which are the butter and which are the oil. So he calls the waiter over, and the waiter, being a rather surly fellow, says, "Well, sniff them yourself and you'll find out." And Caravaggio, an extremely proud man, extremely obviously impulsive man, picks up the plate, smashes it into the waiter's face, injuring him badly. So it gives you a sense, I think, of his foul temper, how touchy and how proud and how mercurial his temper was. And Caravaggio, I get the feeling that living at Cardinal Del Monte is very nice. Cardinal Del Monte, one imagines, is a charming and amusing man who gathers around him all sorts of interesting people. You can imagine the fine dinner parties that he would have, the interesting conversations. But I also get the sense that Caravaggio would rather be in some seedy dive, rubbing shoulders with all sorts of disreputable people and really kind of thriving off that dark energy that he found in the sort of the underbelly of Rome. And I'm sure you all know the fateful conclusion to Caravaggio's time in Rome. It's said that he was in a tennis game that he'd lost and a duel eventuated from that. It's the circumstances are not clear. Ranuccio Tommasoni, who was a kind of a pimp, a bodyguard for the Farnese family, a bit of a thug, and Caravaggio have a duel. And Caravaggio must have been fairly formidable with a sword to get the better of this, this professional sort of bodyguard. Andrew Graham Dixon suggests that Caravaggio even tried to sort of almost ritually castrate his opponent, and his opponent fell back, and he thrust his rapier deep into Ranuccio's thigh, severing his femoral artery. And as you can imagine, the end was very messy and very quick. And the unfortunate Ranuccio passed away, and Caravaggio had no option but to flee immediately. Again, we think that the Colonna family, his old sort of protectress, Costanza Colonna, is there making a villa available for him in the hills outside Rome. But he knows that he's got to leave the territory of the Papal States, and he heads south to Naples, where he finds that he's in great demand. His reputation is even greater than before. Not only is he a famous painter, a genius, but he's a murderer as well. I mean, how fascinating is that? And so he produces a number of important works in Naples, but he's obsessed by this idea of, understandably, of restoring his good reputation, of obtaining a pardon. Fighting and killing someone in a duel carries the death penalty, but he feels that, well, I suppose he feels that it was a fair fight and that there must be some way of being given a pardon. And so, again, perhaps with the help of the Colonna family, a wonderful opportunity to bring about this restoration of his good name and reputation presents itself. And he's invited to join the Knights of Malta on the island of Malta. The Knights of Malta were as proud of their aristocratic status as they were of their piety, as they were of their prowess as tough military men. There's extraordinarily severe, austere military order based on Malta, and they were sort of a later iteration, of course, of the Knights of St. John who'd been on Crete, and they were gradually being pushed westward by Ottoman expansion. So the Knights of Malta were really at the kind of the sort of the frontier, of Christian Europe. They were on the very edge of things. And Caravaggio was delighted to be invited to become one of their members. He had to prove himself first, of course. He didn't have an aristocratic background, as was necessary for the others. But being a famous painter, they could overlook all of that, particularly if he produced some works for them which would bring prestige and honor and fame to their order, which he certainly did. Those of you who have been to Malta will know this wonderful painting, the beheading of St. John, incredibly sort of powerful image. And we start to see Caravaggio begin a new stylistic phase, one in which this sort of sense of optical realism and the dazzling sort of illusionistic nature of painting is gradually giving way to a broader handling, a greater simplicity of composition in the service of a deeper sort of emotional weight. And again, Caravaggio doesn't flinch from the terrible event taking place. It's the only painting he signs, in fact. He again uses accessory figures to draw us into the action. And here's his signature, signed almost melodramatically in the blood of the martyred saint. We can see F. Michelangelo, friar or brother Michelangelo. So he's very proud to announce himself as a member of the order, and is admitted to the order and given great reward. But poor Caravaggio, he's his own worst enemy, isn't he? You know what's going to happen. He's going to do something wrong to undo his good fortune, to destroy this wonderful second chance that he's been given. And so he inevitably gets into a fight with one of the other knights. He's thrown into prison, and again, in another sort of extraordinary reversal of fortune, he manages to escape. Nobody really knows how he gets out of this prison, which still exists, this sort of fortress on Malta, the Castel Sant'Angelo, and he gets to Sicily. We're finally there in Sicily. Taken a while to get here, but and he goes first of all to Syracuse, and you can see this is an old engraving showing Ortigia, the island of Ortigia, and Sicily, very ancient town. It's one of the the famous sites in Sicily then as now was the so-called Ear of Dionysius, which was actually named by Caravaggio. When he was taken there by a local, Caravaggio remarked that how clever Dionysius, the tyrant, was to have constructed this sort of quarry, which enabled him to eavesdrop on the Athenian prisoners who were kept there. And he said how astute this tyrant was to use nature as a model. So here Caravaggio is reminding us how, as a painter, how important nature is to him by this sort of analogous story of the Ear of Dionysus, which as I said, which he named. And for the town of Syracuse, with the help of his old friend Mario Meniti, you remember, who was his model for the card sharps, and he was this sort of very fresh-faced, almost baby-faced young man, the sort of the innocent who's being duped, who's now in Syracuse and is himself a very successful painter. And Mario Meniti gets him the commission to paint this picture here, this amazing picture, the burial of St. Lucy. St. Lucy was an early Christian martyr, patron saint of Syracuse, and a very important early saint in the Christian church. All of these stories of the early saints seem to be similar. They all seem to reject the advances of a Roman citizen, or reject the offer of marriage, preferring to devote their life to Christ. So it's sort of, this is seen as almost a treasonous act, and they're inevitably taken to a brothel and subjected to all sorts of humiliations, which miraculously they are able to escape, and ultimately they're martyred. And so a similar thing happened to Lucy. She's eventually killed by a sort of her throat cut, and we don't see the martyrdom so much here as her burial. And the idea being that in the Middle Ages, people always seem to be on the lookout for saints' relics. They were a valuable thing to have, and the relics of Lucy had been stolen from the city of Syracuse. In fact, the relics of Lucy have a complex story, but I think part of Lucy's relics are, in fact, here in Venice. If you catch a train to Venice, you go to the Santa Lucia station, which is the train station which was built on the church in which her relics were held. So, to cut a long story short, her relics weren't in Syracuse, but the people of Syracuse wanted to remind visitors, to remind their citizens that this is where she was martyred and this is where she was buried. And so Caravaggio painted this work to hang above her burial place. So the grave diggers you see here are literally placed above the earth where the saint would have found her final resting place. And what a wonderful device Caravaggio uses of these sort of burly men who are so strongly contrasted against the frail and lifeless figure of the saint. And Caravaggio here starts to use this sort of pictorial device, which is incredibly effective in his Sicilian paintings. As I said, he's developing a greater breadth of handling, a more sort of powerful and more eloquent compositions. I mean, look at the way he leaves so much of the painting as blank space to suggest, I suppose, this sepulchral, dark, death-like space, the space that exists above the head of the participants in this. So that contrast between the open space and the crowded group of figures, the contrast between these incredibly powerful, sort of giant-like, brutal men and the frail saint, he's really playing on these contrasts for all he can get. And again, we're drawn into the drama, the lifeless figure of the saint. You can see Caravaggio reusing certain motifs. We have memories of the Virgin here, the death of the Virgin. Here's the older woman who holds her face in despair and horror at the scene, inviting us to participate. But I think the most moving part of the picture is the figure on the left-hand side, who glances up. He seems to be, if you look at his face, he seems to be glancing across to the bishop who's blessing. So it's sort of, again, very painted in a very understated and subtle way. He's just that moment of revelation, that moment of awareness that the figure on the left-hand side has. And the other moving part of the painting is Caravaggio perhaps inserting his own self-portrait in here. So we see the painter's furrowed brow. If you can see just a glimpse of the cropped face there on the left-hand side behind the hand, as he looks up again to see the priest blessing, who puts himself as a witness, as this sort of anxiety-filled visage in the very centre of the composition. So this is a wonderful painting to visit because it's still hanging, or it's been moved several times over the centuries, but they've returned it to the place for which it was painted. So you really get that wonderful sense of seeing a painting in the space for which it was intended, and it retains the meaning it was meant to have. It's marking the burial place of Lucy. So yes, there's a nice I think. It's the painting's not in great condition, but it's one of those paintings. I think it's such a sort of a powerful, rugged work anyway. A bit of surface abrasion doesn't really hurt it at all. It, in fact, in a funny sort of way, enhances it. Caravaggio then he moves from Syracuse. He goes to Messina, which is, as you probably know, on the Straits of Messina, the bit that where Sicily is separated from the Italian mainland by only a narrow strait, a very wealthy trading town. And here he paints the raising of Lazarus. You'd think that coming back to life would be a joyful thing, but Caravaggio here presents it as a sort of a dark and forbidding moment. The painting is made for the so-called cross-bearing fathers, the lay organization. So you can see that Lazarus's arms are placed in the sort of the attitude of the crucifixion. So a reminder that the raising of Lazarus gives a foretaste, I suppose, of the resurrection of Christ, who we see on the left-hand side here. Caravaggio integrates the symbolism beautifully into his composition. So Lazarus's right hand is raising up almost to grasp the light, almost to receive the gesture from Christ, and the other hand is reaching down towards a depiction of a skull there. Can you see at the base of the picture? And that wonderful motif of the two upturned heads. It's so powerful, I think. And you can see the handling here. It's becoming looser, it's becoming broader, it's becoming more expressive. So another important example of Caravaggio's late style. And again, Caravaggio inserts himself into the painting. And I think this is particularly moving. Caravaggio, talk about sort of being your own worst enemy and your life continually going wrong and wanting to have another chance. I mean, I just think it's fascinating to think of that this is a painting about a man being brought back to life, painted by somebody who's killed someone, painted by basically a murderer. And if you look above the arm, the red sleeve of Christ, you'll see the features of the painter himself. His hand sort of clasped in a beseeching prayer, looking not so much towards Christ, is he? I don't know, but rather towards the light itself. So a rather kind of enigmatic insertion of Caravaggio's self-portrait into the image itself. So Caravaggio at this time, from all reports of the people who spoke about him, described him as someone who was a very tormented soul. And here's the other painting he made in Messina, considered to be one of his greatest works, which is the Nativity. Again, a nativity scene. We think of Christmas cards, the birth of the Christ child. It's a happy moment in the Christian story, but Caravaggio doesn't show us much hope. It's a wonderfully original and intensely moving, I think, version of the Nativity. These three men who gaze at longing at the tenderness and the humility of the Virgin and the Christ child. And again, Caravaggio's inserts his self-portrait in here. Again, I think a very sort of moving aspect of the painting. He's the bearded figure, the dark beard you can see in the centre there of these three men. He painted it for the Franciscans, and you get the sense of a real sort of a close-knit community with these three integrated figures. And again, you wonder of how traumatized Caravaggio must have been at having been expelled from this order of noble knights. He'd actually been made a knight himself, and he's longing to be sort of integrated back into that community. He also painted another nativity scene. I won't speak too much about this. It's actually a reproduction that's in Palermo. The mafia stole the real one, but it's an incredibly well made reproduction. But it's very similar to the other nativity, but perhaps not quite as intense, showing St. Lawrence on the left, St. Francis, and again this Madonna of humility, a Madonna on the ground who gazes adoringly at the Christ child. Caravaggio goes back to Naples, where he's attacked by thugs. He's very badly sort of beaten, disfigured. We don't know who does that. He's left Sicily now. He paints this at some stage in his career. Again, a self-portrait. Here he paints himself as the severed head of Goliath, who's looked at rather pityingly by David. And it's said that he's painted this, again, this self-portrait, as a sort of a painted request for a pardon from the Pope. The Pope had not yet seen this picture, but again, we get a sense of what a tormented soul Caravaggio was. He eventually got news that he was given a pardon, and he was on his way back to Rome. His boat was stopped by customs officials, and in the officious way of customs official, they thought that there was something a bit funny about this painter. They ordered him to disembark. They interrogated him, and while they were doing so, his boat sailed on with all his belongings, and the customs officials released him, but Caravaggio ran after the boat and collapsed and eventually died in the most abject conditions on this desolate part of the Italian coast, not far from Rome, Porto Ercole, I think it is. He died, as his biographer Bellori said, as miserably as he had lived. So an ignominious end to this great painter of genius. But Caravaggio certainly left his mark on European painting. We can't imagine Velázquez, his great watercolor here, without the example of Caravaggio, the realism, the chiaroscuro, that sort of very gritty and intense way of showing things. And we can't imagine the shadows of Rembrandt without the examples of Caravaggio. So he really brought about a revolution in European painting. He wasn't so influential on Roman painting, but throughout Northern Europe, the influence of the Northern painters working in Rome and in Naples, which was under Spanish control, Spanish painters like Ribera took his style to Spain, where people like Velázquez took it up. So he's now very much in the pantheon of art history. He was neglected for a little while in history, but revived very much in the 20th century. He's with his sort of psychological complexity. He's very much a sort of a figure, I think, for our time. And here he is on the old 100,000 lira note, and I think you can see there his gypsy fortune teller at the top, and his still life on the bottom. And I always think someone had a sense of humor that they would put show a painting representing a theft on a high value banknote. So again, Caravaggio is very much in the pantheon of the great sort of European painters, and I hope that's given you a little bit of an introduction to his life and work. So thank you for your attention, everyone, and please do ask me if you have any questions.
That was absolutely fascinating. Can I begin the questions by asking, how much do you think the colours in his paintings have faded over the hundreds of years since he actually did them? Do we have any knowledge of how vivid the paintings should be today in comparison to what they are?
Yes, well, that's a good question, because I think, well, there are two things. One is that Caravaggio pioneered the use of a dark ground to his canvases. So he'd start with these sort of rather dark brown canvases. And if you've done any painting, you'll know that that's a great way of getting a sense of your composition very quickly because you just put some sort of very dark colors and some light colors on that, and the whole image will appear, a sense of the whole. But it's also a bad thing because oil paint becomes more transparent over time. So yes, I think the paintings have darkened, but I think I mean, certainly there was more color, wasn't there, in those pictures, like the card sharps. He really enjoyed the sort of the brilliant colors of the costumes and so on. And I think he deliberately used darker colors in the later paintings. I think he wanted that sort of rather somber intensity, and he really emphasized that. But I think you're right. I think that certainly they have darkened in time. And what I mean, if you look at his paintings, one of the devices that he likes a lot is to have all these sort of browns and sort of grays and dark shadows, and then he'll really almost like a sort of a like a shriek of sound or a cry. He'll put this bit of sort of intense red into the painting. So it's a very simple palette, and but yes, it can be a bit gloomy sometimes. You're right.
So,
Yeah.
does anyone have any questions they would like to ask David?
David, hi, Anne here.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, why did you call it the first independent still life?
As I understand it, and I might have to correct myself on this, but I do remember reading that it was the first still life painted as a still life for its own sake. As opposed, I mean, people painted still life before, but it was more as a a bit of decoration, an accessory, an ornament to the background, or symbolism. But the idea of just having a painting of objects that you would look at and enjoy for their own sake was a new thing in those days, if you think about it. A little bit like landscape. I mean, people had always painted landscapes going back to, the Flemish painters of the 15th century or earlier, but they were always an accessory to they were always a background. They were never just, here's a nice landscape, let's enjoy that. And same with the still life. So that's considered to be a real milestone.
That's good, thank you.
I noticed that many of the paintings had all the people and the subjects in the bottom half of the canvas. And up the top, there was a lot of spare space, whatever was in the top of the image, like a wall or something. Why would an artist choose to do that?
Well, I think that's something that's very specific to Caravaggio, particularly in those later paintings. They're not sort of comfortable paintings, as I'm sure you've seen, always. And he wants to create that rather sort of oppressive sense, particularly in the burial of St. Lucy, and even in those two main Sicilian ones, and even in the Nativity. But the two others, it's really that sense almost of, who knows? It's open to interpretation, but there's it's a tomb. It's the sort of the great void. It's the empty space. It's that, if you can see what I mean. So he's done it to, I think, suggest that rather sort of gloomy, oppressive, almost deathly space. So as I say, they're not sort of comfortable, easy paintings. He's really wanting to create a powerful and moving image rather than one that will perhaps put you at ease. Yeah.
Thank you. Questions for David? No? Well, David, a huge thank you from all of us. It was a most illuminating and fascinating talk. So just a reminder that David is doing some very exciting tours in Sicily, in Italy, Venice, of course, and also in the south of France. So look those up on the ASA website. I know it's always a treat. I'm speaking from personal experience. Traveling with David, you just learn so much, and you, of course, visit some truly fabulous places. So David, from all of us, a huge thank you for a really fascinating lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Cheryl, for all your technical help. And thanks to ASA for hosting this fabulous lecture. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye all.
Bye bye.